Okay, in this video I am going to look at some examples where we are talking about solving equations by factoring, and most of these equations were quadratic. So to start with, if you look at this first example, notice that this is actually in factored form, which is what we want. Once you get a quadratic down into factored form, the first thing that you have to do is you have to set both factors equal to 0, and then you're going to solve for the variable. In this case, my variable is x, so I would solve for x. So with that being said, I have to take both of my factors here. So I have 2x minus 9, and I'm going to set that equal to 0. And then I have to take my other factor. So on the other side, I have x plus 2, and I'm going to set that equal to 0. So I'm going to solve these as two separate equations, which will give me two solutions. So on this first side, the first thing I need to do is take this 9 and move it. Since it is already negative, to move it says I have to add. So this gives me that 2x is equal to 9. I want to divide the whole thing by 2. Therefore, x is equal to 9/2. Now on the other side, I need to take this 2 here and I need to move it. Since it is being added, to move it says you have to subtract. Therefore we get that x equals -2. Now in both of these instances, I have a variable equals a constant situation. Therefore we would be able to say that your solution is that x equals 9/2 and -2. And this would be what we were looking for when we said solve by factoring. Alright, let's look at another one. Okay, so here again, it doesn't appear like it, but I actually have two separate factors here. So I have to again take each factor and set it equal to 0. So I'm going to take my 3x and set this equal to 0. And then I need to take the stuff in my parentheses, so the x plus 3, and set that equal to 0. Now when I'm looking at equations like this one of the things that I like to keep in mind is that you could essentially view this as this front term here was in a parenthesis of its own. It's just because mathematicians like myself are very, very lazy. We tend not to write anything beyond what we have to. And so usually we would drop this set of parentheses off because it would be considered unnecessary. However, don't forget that technically they would be there, so that's what causes that second factor. So in this first side, I need to divide the whole thing by 3, and when I do that, I end up with x being 0. And then on the other side, I need to take this and I need to move it across the equal sign. Again, because it's being added, to move it says that I subtract. Therefore, this becomes x equals -3. So overall, I can state that I have a solution at x equals 0 or -3. Alright, let's take a look at another one here. Alright, so if you notice in the last two examples I did, both of those equations were already set equal to 0. This one is not. So when we're talking about first things that we need to do, the first thing we need to make sure is that your equation is in standard form. Now, standard form essentially means that your equation is of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now in this case, my equation here is not. I have this minus 5 part. So what I actually have to do is I need to move that 5 to the other side of my equation. Since it is already negative, to move it says I have to add, thus making my equation 3x squared minus the 8x plus 5 equals 0. Now my equation resembles standard form and it is set equal to 0, which means I can start in on trying to solve by factoring. So there are many methods at your disposal that you could use in order to factor equations. So some of those different methods include the following. One, you could do what's called trial by an error. We have the AC method. Now this method I like to call bottoms up, but essentially it's the same thing. We can also use the reverse FOIL idea. So whatever idea or method you choose to use to factor it down is completely personal preference and totally up to you. There are a couple tricks that I like to think about in order to help me decide which method is going to be best suited for the problem I have. One of those has to be, what is the coefficient of my A term? So with that being said, when I'm talking about, say, that AC method or bottoms up, usually I use this if my A is greater than 1. Okay, so if my A is something else, then normally I would revert to that bottoms up method. In order to reverse FOIL or go straight into the factored parts, I generally use this if A equals 1. Okay. Now me personally, I rarely do the trial and error because that method tends to take the absolute longest to try and figure out, and it is the most tedious. So usually me personally, I steer away from that one. I also try to steer everybody else away from it too. So if I were you, I would highly suggest that you avoid trial and error as much as possible. But then again, if that is the method that you prefer, then by all means, please make sure that that is the method that you use. Alright, so that being said, in this here you can see that my A term is greater than 1, so I'll go ahead and use that bottoms up method. So the bottoms up method essentially says that we have to first do A times C. So in this case we're going to do 3 times 5. When you multiply those together you get 15. The next step says you need to find your factors of 15. So this would be 1 and 15, 3 and 5. And then there's a couple things that we need to keep in mind here. First, major thing to keep in mind is the fact that we've got this positive right here. So this positive is actually going to tell us your sign options. So in this case, in order to multiply to a positive, we have two different options. that would be positive times positive or negative times negative. Now the other piece that we have is we have this second sign here, and this tells us which option we need to use. So here this one is going to tell us that you must use the negative times negative option. Okay, so again, the back sign tells you which options you can choose from, but the front sign tells you which of those options has to be used. So what exactly does it mean? It means when I'm looking at my factors down here, both factors have to be negative. And in this case, I want a combination of factors that's going to give me the negative 8. So if I'm looking at my two factors here, I have negative 1 and negative 15, 3 and 5. So the only combination that's going to come close to giving me negative 8 would be that negative 3, negative 5. So once I know that, then I can do what's called set up my factor. So the setup says that I am looking at x plus or minus your factor divided by the a. So I have to set this up for both of these factors here. So in doing so, I'm going to end up with x minus 3 over 3 and x minus 5 over 3. Once we get all of that set up, we have to reduce the fractions. So when we're looking at these fractions here, we need to make sure that we are reducing them accordingly. So that would be this fraction here and this fraction here. So we want to reduce. And in this case, the only one that reduces is this first one, because 3 over 3 becomes a 1. So this essentially is going to become x minus 1, and it's going to leave behind the x minus my 5/3 because I can't do anything there. The last thing that we do is called bottoms up. So bottoms up says anything that you have left in your denominator, like this 3, is going to shift up and become the coefficient of your variable term. So therefore, when we're looking at it, my factors become x minus 1 times 3x minus 5, and this is equal to 0. Now, the whole point of this problem was to actually solve, so at this point we are not actually done. Now we need to do your second step here, which is we need to solve the equation. Okay, so remember, in order to solve says that we have to take each factor and we have to set it equal to 0. So in this case, we would have x minus 1 equals 0, and we would have 3x minus 5 equals 0. So here we need to take this 1 and we need to move it. So this becomes x equals 1. On this other side, the first thing we need to do is take the 5 and move it. Because the 5 is negative, we add. So this becomes 3x equals 5. We need to divide everything by 3. So we get that x equals 5/3. So if we were to actually write out or look at our solution here, your solution would be that x equals 1 and 5/3. And this was what we were looking for. Okay, let's look at another one here. This one usually causes a lot of students to skip it and never come back to it again. It's actually not as scary as it looks. Yes, it is a fraction, but when we're talking about fractions, the first thing that you always want to do is remove the fraction. So here, what we actually want to do is we want to remove the fractions by multiplying with the lowest common denominator. So here I have 8 and I have 2. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply the entire equation here. So this whole equation, I'm going to multiply by the 8. Now when I do that, what's going to happen is you'll see that my fractions are going to completely disappear. So multiplying by that 8 says that this 8 is going to affect all parts. So it's going to affect this first part, it's going to affect the second part, and it's going to affect this third part. So we're essentially doing 8 times each piece. So here we're going to have 8 times the x squared over 8 plus 8 times my x is equal to 8 times the negative 3 over 2. Within each of these, we can cancel. So in this first fraction, my 8's are going to go away. And in this back fraction, my 8's are going to go away, and this is going to leave behind a 4. So here I'm going to have x squared plus my 8x is equal to 4 times negative 3 is a negative 12. Now that I've removed the fractions, you can see how this is actually much nicer, not quite as scary. So the second thing that we now need to do is we need to remember that it needs to be in standard form, which essentially means that we have to set it equal to 0 so that we can solve. So in this case, that means I got to move the 12 over, so this becomes x squared plus an 8x plus 12 equals 0. And now we can go ahead and factor it. Now, because this has an a equal to 1, I would go ahead and work to set up my factors. Again, the biggest thing we need to remember here is again that this sign here tells us that we have to choose either positive times positive or negative times negative. And then the second sign, this sign over here, tells you which to choose, which in this case is going to end up being the positive positive, this one right here. So once we've made our choice, we can open up our parentheses. My x squared is going to split into x and x. I just decided that my signs were both positive, so positive, positive. And now I need to have factors of 12 that are going to give me 8. So I want to look at 12, and I want to look at its factors. So I have 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. And remember, all factors are positive here, so we got to look at those. And we want to know which combination here adds together and gives you 8. So that would be this middle one here. That's 6 plus 2 is 8. So we would input those factors. So this becomes a 2 and this becomes a 6. Now the very last thing that we have to do is we now just simply need to solve. So again, we do that by setting each factor equal to 0. So I have x plus 2 equals 0, and I have that x plus 6 equals 0. I need to get x by itself, So in this first case, I'm going to take this 2 here and I'm going to move it over. And in the second case, again, I'm going to do the same thing, move the 6. So I end up with x equaling -2 and x equaling -6. So if I look at it, it means my solution here is that x is going to be -2 and -6. Okay. Alright, let's look at another one. Now, this one here, the first thing that we actually have to do is we have to distribute n. Why? Is because your goal is that we need standard form that is what we need. And in this current state, we can't get it. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to distribute my outer terms into the parentheses on both sides. So here, this is going to become 2x squared plus an x is equal to a 6x plus 12. And then I need to take each of these pieces and I need to shift them that direction. So this is going to become 2x squared plus my x minus a 6x minus 12 equals 0. Now right here, I need to combine. And it's called combining like terms. And so when I do that, I end up with 2x squared minus a 5x minus 12 equals 0. And so in this case, again, now we have to factor. So again, my a term here is greater than 1. So in order to factor, the first thing that I would do is I would use my bottoms up method. So that's going to be a times c, which in this case is going to be 2 times a -12, and that gives you a -24. I need to find my factors of my 24, so this is going to be 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. Now with that, I have to figure out what is what. So here there's a few things that I need to pay attention to. First is I have this negative sign here. So this sign says that we have to use the option positive times negative. Now the other thing that we know is that the middle sign, or this sign here, is going to tell us that the bigger factor must be negative. Because that's the only way that you can add to a negative number when you have one positive, one negative. So when I'm looking at them, it means all of these small numbers here, these are all going to be positive. And these big numbers over here are the ones that are going to be negative. So I need to know which one of these, when added together, is going to give me a -5. And in this case, I'm going to have it right here with my 8 and 3. So I need to set up my factors. So this is going to end up being x plus 3 over 2, because remember it is factor over a. And then I'm going to have x minus 8 over 2 and this still equals 0. You need to reduce your fractions. This first fraction does not reduce, so this just carries through, which is 3/2. But in the second one, it does reduce. 8 over 2 becomes a 4. And then the last thing to remember is that any denominators that are still left over have to shift up and become partners to your numerator. So this becomes 2x plus 3 times x minus 4 gives me that 0. Now again, I have to be able to solve. So when we're looking at solving, remember that if you're going to solve, it means you need to set equal to 0 and find the variable. So in this case, I have 2x plus 3 equals 0, and I have x minus 4 equals 0. So the easy one says move the 4 over, so this becomes x equals 4. This second one has a couple steps. First is to move the 3, so we get this to be 2x equals negative 3. And then we need to divide everything by 2. And so here we get that x is going to be negative 3/2. So when we take a look at the solution here, my solution is that x is negative 3/2 and 4. Oops. There we go. Alright, let's take a look at one more. Again, you have to backtrack a couple of your steps first, and the reason for that is because of this 6 here. So the first thing that I have to do in this case is I have to FOIL, and that leads me to be able to combine into standard form. Once I get standard form, again remember, then your third step is going to be to factor, and your final step is going to be to solve. Okay, so that's kind of what we're doing. So let's go ahead and FOIL. So when we FOIL, what we have to remember is that first, outer, inner, last. So we're going to multiply your first terms together, your outermost terms together, your innermost terms together, and your last terms together. So we have F O I L, FOIL. So this is going to be x times x, which gives you an x squared. Then I have x times negative 1, so a negative x. I have 4 times x, so plus 4x. And then 4 times negative 1 is a negative 4. And remember, this is equal to 6. Here I need to combine these together. And so what I'm going to end up with is that x squared plus a 3x and then the other thing I have to do here is I have to take this 6 and I need to move it over. So then this becomes minus 10 is equal to 0. And so here in this case, again, one of the things we have to remember is that this sign here tells us that we are going to use the option negative times positive. And so if I want to just go ahead and set this into my factors, I can do just that. So my x squared here is going to break, into x and x. I've got my factors, which say one positive and one negative. And then I need factors of 10 that when added together give me a 3. So I need to look at my factors of 10 here. So when I'm looking at 10, I have 1 and 10, and I have 2 and 5. Now the other thing to keep in mind is that this positive right here tells you that the bigger factor is positive. That being said, that means that these sides over here are positive, whereas these sides are negative. And I need a combination that gives me 3, so that's going to be this combination right here. So in doing so, it means I need to input my values. So the negative 2 is here, and then the positive 5. So the last thing that I have to do is I essentially need to set each equal to 0 and then solve. So I end up with x plus 5 equals 0 and x minus 2 equals 0. So x equals negative 5, x equals 2. So my solution is going to be that x is negative 5 and 2. So there you have it. That in a nutshell is everything that you need to know to get started with being able to solve quadratic equations through factoring. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate. Let me know. Otherwise, have fun with your math, be creative, and I'll see you next time.